But it's Canadian military. Like, how does it do?
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Mylène Simard. I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Bookseller itself rests on the land that was once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of On the Road to Abandoned Manitoba, Taking the Scenic Route Through Historic Places by Gordon Goldsborough. Thanks so much for Great Plains Press for publishing this book and for making this evening a possibility. Following a presentation from Gordon, there will be the opportunity to ask questions. So if you are here in person, I will ask that you raise your hand. I will come find you with the microphone so that the people at home who are watching on the live stream can hear your questions. And if you are watching from home on the live stream, please feel free to type your questions into the chat and we'll do our best to pass along to Gordon. I will be back at the close of the event to review signing procedures, but we will ask that you remain seated for a few moments when we're done and transporting Gordon safely over to the signing desk, which is over by the cash tills. There will be books for sale over at the cash till and on the signing desk. In his latest Abandoned Manitoba series, scientist historian Gordon Goldsborough hits the road in search of adventure and little-known stories from Manitoba's past. Among the places he visits are underground radiation monitoring posts from the Cold War, a remote hydroelectric generating station, cruise ships on the Red River, and the original route of the Trans-Canada Highway. Gordon Goldsborough is an active member of the Manitoba Historical Society. He has written 4 books on Manitoba history, including the national bestsellers, Abandoned Manitoba and More Abandoned Manitoba, the latter receiving a McNally Robinson Book of the Year award in 2019. He has a weekly series on Manitoba history on CBC Radio 1, a weekly column on Manitoba history in the Manitoba Cooperators newspaper, and is secretary to the board for the Manitoba Agricultural Museum. In recognition of his historical and scientific work, he was inducted into the Order of Manitoba in 2021. That's it, a long list of accomplishments. Thank you all for coming in large numbers tonight, and I will hand over the podium to our host, Gordon.
Well, thank you, Mylène, and thank you to everyone who has come out this evening. It's always very gratifying to see a crowd because I love sharing what I've learned with people. And so I'm going to give you a little taste of what the book contains. This is not going to be your typical book launch where they do learned readings from the book. I'm just going to talk about some of the things that are in it. I won't be able to talk about all of it because that would take far too long, but it'll hopefully give you enough of a taste that'll give you a sense of what this book entails. And the title of it is quite descriptive, On the Road to Abandoned Manitoba. I believe strongly in getting out and seeing things. And in fact, this is kind of where this whole thing got started. Let me just see if I can, oh, hang on. Is it turned on? Oh, there we go. There. The origins of this book go back to 2010. When I began doing a project for the Manitoba Historical Society, with whom I've been volunteering for a long time, to map the locations of interesting historic places around the province. Initially, the plan was to include 12 places, but inevitably, as a lot of my projects tend to do, it snowballs. And so as of a couple of days ago, oh, Glenn, it's still not advancing. There's probably a bunch of them here. Okay. Oh, now is it gonna? Oh, there it goes. Okay, good. Okay, as of a couple of days ago, we have mapped 9,502 places. And there are all sorts of things ranging from buildings to monuments to cemeteries to archives and museums. There's a whole category that we call other because there was a lot of things that just defied conventional labels. For example, we found a brick outhouse. You'll notice, by the way, that I give it a polite term. There is another less polite term for it, but we did find one, in fact, as well as one made out of stone. So there's all kinds of things. A lot of things, if you go to the spot, you'll find absolutely nothing because there was something there in the past that is now gone. Some of you know that I'm passionate about grain elevators. I'll talk a little bit about them tonight. And we are interested in mapping the locations of each and every grain elevator that ever operated in the province. And that's therefore the location category. I should say, by the way, that the vast majority of the sites we've mapped are outside of Winnipeg, which, well, is simply a reflection of reality. There's a huge area out there, but it's perhaps also a reflection of my personal bias, which is I would like people to get out and see the province. And there is a perception, I'm not sure if it's a correct one, by people living outside of Winnipeg that Winnipeggers don't really know what's going on beyond the perimeter highway. And I'm not sure that's true, but I'd like to think that if they know what's out there to be seen, those Winnipeggers who don't want to travel beyond the perimeter might be enticed to do so. And so that's, I guess, my underlying motive here is to get people out and seeing Manitoba. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest you have to do it at the wheel of a car. You could ride a bike, you could snowshoe, you could ride a horse, you could walk. You know, I mean, you could see all sorts of things if you're just willing to get out and see them. And by the way, we can help too. The Manitoba Historical Society has on its website an interactive map that I'm giving you the address for here, mhs.ca/map2. It works with a smartphone, it works with a tablet, with a laptop, a desktop, basically any computing device. And it has a searchable interface, which means you can put in keywords or key phrases and it'll show you what matches those criteria on the map. So if, for example, you want to see the remaining grain elevators, not the ones that were long gone, but the ones that still stand today, this is the map that shows that. Each of the little red symbols denotes an elevator. And you think, yeah, there's lots of them out there. Well, actually, only about 60 of them are still in use. The other ones are sitting vacant, and they do disappear all the time. So it's something that I would suggest if you are at all interested in our agricultural history, go out and check out some elevators, especially the ones up at Inglis, because they are magnificent. Now, I was fortunate back in 2015, after I had been talking about some of the places that I have been discovering in the course of my travels around Manitoba on the CBC Weekend CBC Radio Weekend Morning Show, who, by the way, I have to give a big shout out to, because if it wasn't for them giving me the ability to indulge my curiosity every week, none of this would have happened. But in 2015, after I'd been talking on the radio for a few months, I had a call from Greg Shilliday at Great Plains saying, would you be interested in doing a book about the things you're talking about? And I was like, whoa, I don't know that anybody's really going to be interested in buying a book about abandoned places, but sure, why not? So I did, and it came out in 2016, and it did, well, way better than my expectations, because I thought, it's kind of niche. But it did well enough that the good folks at Great Plains said, well, then I think there's room for a sequel. And they chose the title, More Abandoned Manitoba. I must say, by the way, that I wasn't keen on the title because, it seems kind of just repetitive, Abandoned Manitoba, More Abandoned Manitoba. But they assured me that this was good marketing technique. If you enjoyed Abandoned Manitoba, you would want more of what you had enjoyed. So, okay, fine. Incidentally, I did prevail to choose the subtitle of that book. I'd given them some choices, and my first choice for that second book, I love alliteration. I guess with a name like Gordon Goldsborough, it would be natural. So I chose as the subtitle for the book, Biffies, Barns, and Booze. And they said, well, you know, that's a little crude. So they chose the second choice, which was rivers, rails, and ruins. Okay, it's okay. But, you know, so I was really starting to think, well, what are we going to call the next book if there is one? And of course, we had a bit of a situation that happened over a few years. It kind of slowed me down a little bit. So this new book has taken 5 years since the last one. But I was thinking, what's the next one going to be called? And so knowing they're wanting to keep it sort of memorable, I thought, what are they going to choose this one to be called? More, or even more? But I had suggested the idea of, you know, being on the road, you know, on the road to Abandoned Manitoba. And I'm very glad that they chose my suggestion. So I take no responsibility for it, but I love the title this time. So there you go. In these books, and I tell people, you do not have to read them in series. There's not any sort of story that builds from one book to another. Essentially, each one of them is a set of collective stories about interesting places. And I feel very strongly about telling the story of places. You know, there are a lot of books that show you pictures of things, pictures of abandoned buildings and abandoned cars and so on. But to me, there isn't really the nucleus of a story there, just looking at the pictures. I need to know, why was it there in the first place and what caused it to be abandoned? You know, and that to me is where the interest falls. And so inevitably, when each of these books appears, you know, when I look back at the previous book, I go, well, things have changed and I have to update it. So yes, you can read each book in whatever order you wish. Just know, however, that there are occasionally spoilers for some of the preceding books because I have updated the information. So, for example, in that vein, in the last book, More Abandoned Manitoba, I told the story of the grain elevator at Elva. If you don't know where Elva is, you can be excused. It's not a very big place down in southwestern Manitoba near the border with Saskatchewan. This is a view of Elva in its heyday. It was a pretty small place even then. But of course, notable in the picture here is that it had 2 grain elevators. Both of those grain elevators persisted into the 21st century. And in fact, one of those grain elevators, this one, I think was particularly significant in that, well, it had gained the mantle of the oldest elevator in Manitoba. Unfortunately, because anything older than that had already been torn down. But there was one that was a little bit older and at Fleming, Saskatchewan, which unfortunately fell to the arsonist. And as a result, this elevator then, I think, took on the title of the oldest grain elevator in Canada. And I thought that's pretty significant. It would be nice if it could be recognized in some fashion. Unfortunately, time was not kind, and it was starting to really deteriorate. The wood was getting quite badly deteriorated. Fortunately, at least, you know, because and a lot of them just literally fall apart until something happens and they just aren't around anymore. But in this case, a fine gentleman named Troy Angus came on the scene. He bought it and began to deconstruct it. And by the way, that's a different thing than demolish. Demolish, you just knock it down and haul away the scraps. In this case, Troy was carefully taking it apart. You know, because when they built these things, and this one dates back to 1897, they used superior materials. You know, and so if they could be salvaged, you know, it's sad to think the elevator might be gone, but at least you could think whatever was built with its remains, you know, is a nice legacy that it carries on. So Troy began carefully deconstructing it. Unfortunately, as sometimes happens, accidents occurred. And before he could complete the deconstruction, in fact, before he could complete most of the deconstruction, it burned. A spark happened to get inside. The building was tinder dry, and within minutes, it was in a blaze. So unfortunately, it's gone. Its neighbor, just a little ways away, was fully deconstructed, and so therefore, you know, both elevators now at Elva are gone. But before the building burned here, Troy, bless his soul, pulled a bunch of stuff out of it that he didn't think it would have particular value. It wasn't lumber that he could sell, but it was stuff that he thought somebody who was passionate about grain elevators might want. So a couple of months ago, a friend of mine said, "Oh, I was out in Western Manitoba, and this guy handed me a box and said, would you give this to Gordon Goldsborough?" And so I brought the box contents here. Well, actually, I brought the box too. And if at any point you want to have a look at it later on, I would encourage you to do so. One of the real highlights of the box was a piece of the leg. Now, for those of you who don't know, the leg is the critical part of a grain elevator because it's what does the elevating. The whole premise of a grain elevator is you dump grain at the bottom and then the leg carries it to the top, and then there's a distributor that sends it into various bins. Well, over the course of decades, the fact that grain flows across the surface of wood, well, it acts almost like sandblasting, and it sculpts away the softer parts of the wood, leaving behind the harder parts. And you end up with this beautiful material that is actually quite valuable to some people. And so Troy sent me a piece of the leg from that original elevator. So I'm very pleased to get it. It's up here at the front. So at some point, if you're interested, come and have a look at it. Troy also sent me, I'm going to go off camera, folks, for a minute. So hang on, I'll be back. He also sent me some other cool stuff. At some point, people were repairing the elevator, I suspect, and they left behind all kinds of things that, well, I know the people here said, oh, we won't want to spill water on them. And said, well, they're not valuable. They're just interesting. There's a pack of Virginia tobacco. There's an old O. Henry bar. This is all stuff that probably was left behind by workers. There's a sign about the operation of the grain elevator, what was to do and not to do. But the other real highlight for me is that he gave me the map. So when they were loading the elevator, they would have written down what they were putting in each of the bins of the elevator, so that when they wanted to get grain out, they'd say, oh, we have to go into bin 14 and get that. And so this was hanging in the elevator, and they would have filled in what was in each of the bins. So he gave it to me. And I treasure this just because it's a reminder of that part of Manitoba and that bit of history, of the agricultural history of the province. So that's one of the updates that I provide in this book, is the update on the status of the Elva elevator. It was still standing when the last book came out. It is now regretfully gone. So that's one part. Another part is that I have new stories. And I have to tell you, one of my great advantages is that I have lots of former students who know my passion for Manitoba history and often find things that I don't know about. And they will then send me photographs or text messages. So for example, a few years ago, one of my former students, Elise Watchorn, who works for Environment and Climate Change Canada today, and who, by the way, was planning to be here tonight, but she was flying back from a holiday overseas. And now you tell me if this sounds like a valid excuse. She was at the airport in Montreal, and a bunch of paper cups got sucked into the engine of their plane. If you had to come up with a sort of a quasi-plausible excuse, that kind of sounds pretty good, right? Anyway, so she sends apologies that she wasn't able to be here tonight. I was going to give her a big shout out because, well, it was thanks to her that one of the chapters came to be in this book, because she was out traveling for her work north of Hecla Island on the west side of the Lake Winnipeg. And she said there was this structure she had found, a rather strange looking thing. Oh, and by the way, this is me, in case you didn't recognize me. I looked like this until about 4 weeks ago. I have to say, I was starting to get a little tired of it. My wife hated it. And in fact, I think one of the last straws when a guy asked if I would be interested in being a department store Santa. She said, you know, there's this thing, and it's along the highway, and it looks like a culvert sticking straight out of the ground, but it's got a lid on top. And if you lift the lid off, there's a ladder going down into darkness. She said, what is it? Well, I don't know. So I had to do some research. And now, unfortunately for me, I didn't make contact with Gilles Messier, who's here tonight, who is the world's expert, I think, on this and knows way more about it than I do. It might have saved me a lot of trips to Ottawa, unfortunately, if I'd met him sooner. But what it was inside looked like this. In fact, I got to tell you this a little bit about Elise. She is very safety conscious. And she worried that if she climbed down in this ladder, you know, there might not be any oxygen down there, you know, because sometimes if you climb into a septic tank, for example, that could be dangerous. So she had the presence of mind to light a match and drop it, thinking, well, if it lands at the bottom and it goes out, there's no oxygen down there. I'll better not go down. So she dropped the match and it went out. So she held her breath and climbed down. You just have to know Elise. That is perfectly consistent. And at the bottom, she saw a couple of bunk beds. She saw a shelving unit. And like, what is this thing? It looked almost like some kind of bomb shelter. But why would you put a bomb shelter in the middle of nowhere and for only 2 people? Wouldn't you want to have room for more? It wasn't really close to anything. So if it was a shelter, you wouldn't want to have to drive 20 minutes to get to it. You'd want it right where you were. Well, it was only through my visits to the National Archives, along with research by a historian at the Canadian War Museum, Andrew Birch, and Gilles and his great work, that I know now that it's what's called an FRP, which stands for Fallout Reporting Post. The premise is that back in the 1960s, the Canadian government was very worried by the possibility of a catastrophe. Canada was sitting between 2 major antagonists, the Soviet Union and the United States, each of whom had nuclear capability. And so there was a very real chance that one or the other could lob a nuclear missile at the other, and it might detonate in Canada or it might blast somewhere close by, and there could have to be massive evacuations. And so as to be able to manage this, the Canadian government decided to build a network across Canada of about 2,000 stations. And the idea would be they would leave a couple of people to staff this station, and they would, over a period of, well, I don't know how long. I don't know if Gilles, 2 weeks? Okay. And that's what I wondered, how long will these poor sods have to go down there and basically take radiation measurements and then send those measurements to some central clearinghouse where they would collate them with the results from other stations and then be able to look at where hotspots of radioactivity were, and then they could direct evacuations. Well, this is a map based on the work that Andrew Birch had shared with me, and it shows the locations of the FRPs built in Manitoba. Now, originally they were going to be 249, I think that's close to being right, of which they only ended up building 192. They didn't build any north of 55. My suspicion is because they just thought population density was simply too low to warrant the expense. But they did build quite a lot of them in the south, as you can see. And the different colors, this map, by the way, is in the book. The different colors denote the different types of sites. Some of them were in underground sites, like the one I showed you, 23% of them. 45% were in basements. Typically of government-controlled buildings, things like post offices or RCMP detachments. Some of them were above ground, and then some of them we just don't yet know what kind of structure they were. But some of them, here's one that was found in the basement of the post office in Deloraine. Looks quite different than the one I showed you before. This one is kind of typical of the basement ones, I think, though, isn't it, Jill? It's made of cinder blocks. And of course, if you've ever had experience with cinder blocks, they have a couple of holes perforated through them, and they would fill those with sand to increase the radiation absorptiveness. The doorway went in and immediately took a 90-degree turn because radiation can't turn corners. So the idea was to protect the people inside from radiation. In case, and one of the things I was interested in initially is why did they have then one that had holes through it? Wouldn't that kind of defeat the purpose? Well, my suspicion, and maybe Jill, you know better, my suspicion is that was where the vent stack for the toilet went out. Because can you imagine being in there for 2 weeks next to a toilet without any kind of flushing? That would have been pretty pleasant. Well, actually, in this case, no, because the range hood was actually over on the other side of this one. So unless they had a vent going all the way around it, but I tell you, if you want to know anything else about it, don't ask me. He's your guy right there. But along the way, in the course of doing the research for this thing, one of the things I came across at the National Archives here in Winnipeg were some blueprints for designing them. And one of the things they showed on these blueprints was the equipment, or at least one of the pieces of equipment that they were to be equipped with, a radiation meter. So not surprisingly, of course, you'd have to have something like that. And so I thought, it was called a Radiac. And just out of curiosity, I just Googled Radiac to see what would show up. And what showed up was an eBay auction for a radiation meter. I thought, wow. So I looked at it. It was Canadian military issue, and it was in California. I thought, huh. Anyway, so I bought it. And there it is. There's me in my shaggy phase again. And there it is right there. So later, if you're interested in looking at Cold War tech, there it is. I've actually had an electronics specialist look at it, and he threw up his hands. There's nothing in there that he can service. But it's an interesting insight to that time in Manitoba's history. Back in the early 1960s, fortunately for us, nothing ever happened. They never needed to use these things other than a training exercise, so good for us. And we now have a story to tell in this book, and then ultimately in Gilles' book, because he's going to do a much more thorough treatment than I will ever hope to do. But let's come back for a moment to the central theme of this book, which is on the road to Abandoned Manitoba. One of the other places that I was able to visit in the course of travels for this book was right at the Ontario border. I was there, by the way, thanks to Clint Cannon, who wrote a wonderful book back in 2018 about the Trans-Canada Highway and his travels going east towards the Maritimes. One of the things he showed in his book was that at the Ontario border, there was a section of the old Trans-Canada. And I thought, oh, that's neat. So I went and checked it out, and sure enough, the pavement is still there. The line down the center is still there. The grass is starting to colonize the cracks. The trees are starting to overgrow, but it's kind of neat to think that this highway is still there. And this particular stretch is really significant because it was completed in 1932. In June of that year, they had a ceremony to commemorate the linkage of the Trans-Canada in Manitoba with the counterpart in Ontario. Now, previous to this, if you wanted to go to Kenora, for example, you had to take the train. Once there was a highway that you could take, well, then you could go anytime you wanted. You could stop along the way. You could take detours. You could chit chat with people. You know, it was really quite a different, and I would argue better experience once you had this flexibility of being able to drive. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the full Trans-Canada was created, but this was one of the first linkages interprovincially in June of 1932. And in fact, to commemorate this particularly momentous occasion, the officials had put up a monument. And this, thanks to my friend Doris Ames, she shared this picture from her family album. Doris is in the middle, her two sisters and her grandfather, they were on a family holiday. And in 1958, they stopped and had their picture taken next to that monument. It was unveiled, to say, in 1932, and they had names on the plaque of the Ontario government officials who were at that ceremony, the Manitoba government officials that were at the ceremony. And Clint said that, well, you know, the monument might still be there. So, of course, I had to go see. And sure enough, yes, it is still there. Well, it was still there in 2019 when I took this picture. As some of you know, recently the provincial government has committed to twinning the Trans-Canada right to the Ontario border. And I looked at the design for it. It's supposed to go right through the site of the old monument. So it's possible that it may not be there anymore. I tried to check it out this past summer. We were doing some reconnoitering in the area, and I went over to the site, and there were construction trucks and piles of equipment, and guys are running all over the place. I just didn't want to go in there. So I don't know. It might be there, it might not. But you'll notice that the plaque is gone, but it hasn't gone far. It's actually just a little ways down the highway at the Visitor Information Center, just mounted on the door. As you're going into the building, hang a left. It's right there on the wall. Still reminding us of that momentous occasion when Manitoba joined into a larger confederation by way of the highway. Now, so that's one of the things that monument and what it represented, that linkage of provinces, really started me thinking about, you know, getting out on highways and being able to explore and meet people and find things and learn interesting history. And another aspect that really got me thinking were old bridges. Another one of my passions, by the way, I have quite a few passions, were old bridges, particularly ones that were built almost 100 years ago. And so a number of years ago, I worked with the kind folks at Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba in a project to map old bridges. And we just picked arbitrarily 1930. thinking, well, there won't be very many of those. Well, it turns out we've mapped, I think it was over 140 of them. A lot of them being very inconspicuous. You would never know they were there unless you knew exactly where they were. And by the way, we can tell you exactly because we have coordinates for them all. But you know, there was a lot that were really conspicuous too. So this particular specimen that's northwest of Russell, crossing the Assiniboine River, was one that I found a number of years ago when I was sitting watching television with my wife in the evening with Google Earth running on my laptop, and I was following along the Assiniboine looking for places where there might be a bridge. This is what history nerds do. And so I found one that looked vaguely like a bridge. The resolution wasn't so good, so I made a note of it in my log, and I figured I'll check it out next time I'm there. When I got to the site, yes, indeed, it was a nice old bridge, a through truss bridge built in 1928. And I thought, why? Why did they build this bridge here? Because it's really a substantial bridge. It's not the sort of thing I would expect to see on a small country road, which it was. Turned out after doing some research on it that until 1966, it was the way that Highway 16, the Yellowhead Highway, had crossed the Assiniboine River. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of neat. And it was only when they built a new bridge to the south that it was left behind, and it's still used for local traffic. And I thought, the old highways, that's kind of a neat theme. So that's what got me thinking about whether or not I could maybe, as a distant adventure, go out and drive one of these old highways. And of course, the Trans-Canada, because of its significance, I thought, I'm going to drive the original route of the Trans-Canada Highway as best I can. You know, there's probably sections that I won't be able to travel. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drive it. So I was talking to a good friend of mine who's sitting right over there, Don Wage. And I was saying to Don, I'm thinking of driving the old Trans-Canada. He says, that's a really cool idea, but I have an even better idea. How about if you drove it in an antique car? I said, wow, that is a good idea. Do you know who has one? He says, well, I do. I have a 1923 Ford Model T. 1923, which means this year it is 100 years old. It's beautiful. It's immaculate. In fact, I love this picture. This is Don at the wheel, by the way, in his period costume. Everything, in my mind, everything about this picture is original. The sort of state of the highway at that time is original. The bridge in the background is an example of what's called a bowstring, and they're rare. There's only 5 of them that we know of in the province. Some people say, well, yes, but notice power lines. No, that's actually the very first high voltage transmission line between Winnipeg and Port-au-La Prairie that was installed in 1920. So everything about this picture is original. So Don said, why don't we drive the original Trans-Canada in the T? I said, well, can the old boy do it? It's like, you know, how far have you driven it before? He says, oh, I had about 60 miles or so. And I said, well, Don, this is 545 kilometers. I've mapped it. He says, do you think it'll make it? And he says, well, I guess we'll find out. So then I was telling another good friend, David Rourke, about our plan. And he said, well, I've got a 1928 Model A. Can I come along? I thought, well, that's probably not a bad idea. You know, the 2 old cars, it might not make it. It'd be good to have a backup in case one of them poops out, we can climb in the other car. So that was going to be it. There were going to be these 2 old cars driving the Trans-Canada. Well, then the word started to get around. And, you know, honestly, if we'd kind of let it go its natural course, we probably could have had 50 or 100 cars. But in the end, we insisted that it had to be down to just 5. The 1 Model T and 4 Model A's, the youngest of which was a 1931. I get that right. I never remember exactly. 31 or 32. Anyway, it was basically almost 92 years old, and its driver, Dave Allenson, was 92 years old. And so our plan was we were going to do what we called the Pine to Prairie Relic Run. From the pines of Ontario to the prairies of Saskatchewan, along the original route of the Trans-Canada in 5 relics, 5 old cars, across 3 days in July. We were going to go to Ontario to Winnipeg the first day, Winnipeg to Brandon the second day, Brandon to Saskatchewan the third day. That was our plan. But I had to give some sort of schedule to all this. I thought, for example, we might have to make stops along the way. because, the old boys might need to cool down a little bit. They're old cars. The drivers might likewise need a bit of a rest. And I thought it might be nice to stop along the way, stop at museums and such. So I wanted to make up a schedule of where we would get, by various times. So I said to Don, how fast do you think the car can go? Just so I can kind of work out a schedule. He said, well, when the T was introduced, it had a maximum speed of 68 kilometers an hour. Oh, okay. He says, well, but the old boy, he's getting old. Maybe we shouldn't push him past about 40 kilometers an hour. Okay, fine. So that was going to be the plan. We started off from close to the Ontario border at 40 kilometers an hour. We're bobbing along. And I have to tell you, there is nothing like a slow travel like that to give you a real sense of the countryside. All the other vehicles were rushing by at, 90, 100, 110, and you can't see anything at that speed. 40, you nice, a calm, gentle ride, and you have lots of time to enjoy the countryside. Manitoba is gorgeous. And so we had a nice ride. We got to our first stop, and I said to Don, how's the old boy doing? He said, oh, he's just popping right along. Let's go up to 50. Okay, sure. And so we went along for a little while further, and we stopped another. How's the guy doing? Oh, he's loving it. He's just great. Let's go up to 55. So we went up to 55. That's when the problems began. Because by the way, I have to be careful here, not with the Model T, with one of the Model A's. We think it probably had a failing water pump, and it therefore couldn't exhaust all the heat it was producing. And so we had to back off to 50. So the rest of the trip, other than when we were on gravel, and actually the last part of the trip out near the Saskatchewan border was all on gravel. We did 40 when we were on gravel, but otherwise 50 was sort of our cruising speed. And it was delightful. In fact, just to give you a little bit of a sense of things, and I hope this is going to work. There we are in the T, cruising along a nice gravel road, a portion of the Trans-Canada, mind you, towards the Saskatchewan border, just before we get there. And when we got there, well, of course, we lined up all the cars, and everybody congratulated themselves that all 5 cars made it. We were expecting catastrophes. We thought at least one of the cars would break down. Turns out they didn't even have a flat tire. They had to tweak the brakes on one of the cars. They had to tweak the carburetor on one of the cars. But otherwise, I have to say, the only real mechanical problems we had with one of the modern cars that was following along. So that's the remarkable thing, I think. And it was just such a fun ride, to give us the experience of what it must have been like to travel back in that day of, the 1920s, early 1930s. But I have one more thing to tell you, because once we sort of finished the celebration at the Saskatchewan border, Dawn and I had to go back to Elkhorn, because that's where we had left the trailer that the old T was going to be loaded up on to take it home. And so we just, rather than drive back on the old gravel road, we thought, well, let's go up onto the new, comparatively new gravel, concrete highway, the new modern Trans-Canada highway. And so we got it on the highway, and Dawn said, let's see what the old boy can do. Well, one thing you should know is that Model Ts don't have a speedometer. So you don't know how fast you're going. But I'm carrying a GPS receiver, which has a speed indicator. We got the old boy up to 70.1 kilometers an hour, faster than he was supposed to be able to go. So, Dawn, I am still forever in your debt. This book really, I think, benefited from this experience that I had. I say, if nothing else, it really accentuated the theme for me of on the road. I'm a big science fiction fan, and I especially love things that relate to time travel, because I'm always thinking, wouldn't it be so much fun to go back in time and see this or that? Well, I pretty much had that experience this summer over 3 days in July, and Dawn gave them to me. So thank you, Dawn. So the cover of my book then, the one that came out a few weeks ago, is On the Road to Abandoned Manitoba. And it features Don Wage in his Model T. I also, by the way, need to give another big shout out to George Penner, who accompanied us on the Relic Run and took numerous photos along the way. In fact, that very first photo that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, That was one of George's, and I love it. It's just so evocative of what I think the old experience was driving the Trans-Canada Highway. It has one of my favorite bowstrings in the background. I just love everything about this title. I even like the subtitle, Taking the Scenic Route Through Historic Places. And, you know, this is something I really feel strongly about, is getting people out and seeing those historic places. And that's why, you know, I've been mapping them. That's why I've been taking the coordinates for them. In every single chapter in the book, I give you the latitude and longitude. You plug them into your smartphone app, you put them into your GPS receiver, and I'll navigate you right to them. You know, so there's no excuses. You know, there's no reason you can't get out and see these things. And I really do hope that you will get out and see some of the things that I've had the good fortune to see. Just in closing, I want to offer thanks. And, you know, the reality is I really have many, many, many people to thank. But I'd like to start with thanks to the good folks at Friesens in Altona. They were the ones who printed the book. And oh, I had the most wonderful experience a few weeks ago. I got to go and see my book being born. As a father, I'm very proud to say that I was in the delivery room to see my 2 kids being born. And, you know, in a sort of an analogous way, I wanted to see my latest baby being born. And so I got to see it coming off the production line. That's one of the thanks I want to offer, but there are many, many more. I want to thank, first of all, my wife, Maria, who is, I think, a self-described history widow. And she is long-suffering, but I hope in the end, the proceeds from my travels will hopefully benefit us by way of a nice warm holiday, maybe in a month or 2 months. My daughter, Stephanie, my son, Joseph, they put up with me being away a lot when I was out on the road exploring various places in Abandoned Manitoba. The good folks at CBC Manitoba, there's many of them, one of whom is standing at the back. It's almost my brother by a different mother, Darren Bernhardt, and all the other people that have helped me and tell the stories of abandonment around the province. I'm still very grateful to them. I had a great experience this morning that I think might end up showing up either with a story from Darren or from me or somebody. A great experience. There's so much about my relationship with CBC that I enjoy. The folks at Great Plains Press, particularly Mel, Katrina, and Keith. I think Keith is here somewhere. Where are you, Keith? Give him a wave. He's over in the corner there. Thank you. The research, you know, none of these stories just come out of my work as a work of fiction. They all are the result of research. And I am utterly dependent on archives that you can find all sorts of places, but especially at the Legislative Library of Manitoba and the Archives of Manitoba, conveniently located in the same building. So, you know, it's just a wonderful place to fill in all sorts of gaps in your knowledge. There's other places, of course. I went to the National Archives and so other places too. George, as I mentioned, the photographer, not only on the Relic Run, but a host of other photos appear in this book. Jim Burns, who is here. Where is Jim? Give yourself. He was the copy editor. I'm always fearful of mistakes, and I realize I'm not perfect. I realize that any mistake that still appears in the book is my responsibility, but I'd like to think that Jim was a sober third thought. Mario, my wife, was the second thought. Jim was the third, so hopefully between the 3 of us, we caught most of those things. Holly Thorne, likewise, did lots of photography. Several of her pictures are in there, some wonderful pictures. Paige Cowell, one of my former graduate students, drew the maps. She is a GIS god and was able to do maps way better than I could. And then a host of other good folks. And I realize it's pretty small to read. So if you can't see your name on this list and you helped me, I'd like to think it's because you guys can't see it. But if it's not there, I apologize. I tried my best to reconstruct everybody who had helped me along the way. And it is a lot of people. You know, ultimately, yes, it's my book, but I also am so grateful for all of the support I've had from many, many people over the years. This is not my own work. It is ultimately the work of a whole lot of people. So I hope by some small amount, I have raised your interest in this book tonight. Perhaps you may wish to purchase a copy, and if you are, I would be very pleased to inscribe it for you if you wish. If you are interested in either of my previous 2 books, I don't know if they actually have copies of them here, but I'm told that they are getting more. So if you want a copy of Abandoned Manitoba or more Abandoned Manitoba, they apparently will have them soon. I really should give a big shout out also to McNally Robinson. They are, as far as I'm concerned, the perfect example of what a bookstore should be. And unfortunately, there's a lot of other bookstores that are, well, whatever they are. So thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm so grateful for the support. Thank you very much.
We will open the floor to questions. Here, I'll give it to you this way.
Okay, that's
I
good.
know you like to
I like to
move around.
Hope it's not on. Yep.
Okay, great. You got a question right here.
Well, first of all, I've been following you for many years, and
That who was behind me? I always wondered.
on the radio.
Oh, okay.
You're my reason for getting up Sunday mornings. I just really, so it's just delightful.
We do record them, and they're online if you ever
Yes,
miss.
yes. Well, I'm going with this. Like, to have the print books is great. You're a great orator, and I just did a road trip visiting my kids down in Wisconsin. And I had Stuart McLean as my accompaniment, because I'm a Luddite. I don't have all the technology, but I do have a CD player. And I'm just suggesting to have you actually read and record your books would be amazing. You know, there are people that are visually impaired. Yep. And would delight in hearing your stories. So just a little seed. I don't know if you've thought about it, if it's been suggested, but I'm suggesting it.
One of them already exists as an audiobook.
Really?
Yes, the very first one, Abandoned Manitoba. During the pandemic, I spent, 3 weeks in the studio, off and on, reading. Now, and what I did too, because of course this was now a book that was several years in the past for me, I felt it was important to bring it up to date as well. So the audiobook is actually superior in some ways to the physical book, because I actually, for each of the chapters, have a little short update chapter as well. And another thing, of course, is I'm a very visual person. I have lots of pictures in these books, and I felt kind of strongly that if you were listening to an audiobook, you would lose out in some way, that you couldn't see the pictures. So we made a supplement that went along that you could download along with the audiobook, so that you could then, as you were listening, you could look at the pictures. And then they were in the same order as, so you flip the next page, and I would talk about that and flip the next page. So we did the one book, and I'm not sure to what extent it has been successful. I don't track that kind of thing. I would certainly, I'm looking at Keith right now. I would be more than happy to record audiobooks for the other two. I had a great time in the studio. It was so much fun.
So where is it available?
Audible, which is the sort of the main audio book place. I don't know, is there any other place besides Audible, Keith?
Audible, our website, and like anywhere that has audiobooks.
In fact, that's right. I searched Amazon yesterday, and it was showing up as print, as a Kindle book. You can get it for your Kindle reader, or as an audiobook for that first book.
Okay, well, now I know. Thank you.
Was that an audience plan to promote? Anybody else in the audience? Oh, right here.
What's your favorite chapter from the book?
Oh no. I don't know about other authors, but this is one that I always worry about, because I don't know what my favorite one is. It's almost the one that I have told most recently, because I love them all. I mean, the fact of the matter is I couldn't put everything in the book that I wanted to. You know, those people at the publishers, you know, they were dictatorial. It can be no more than this many pages. Okay, I'll just this is off the top of my head. One of the things that I really enjoyed sharing about was the story of Xanthoria. Now, Xanthoria might sound like a planet that Captain Kirk and the USS Enterprise might visit, the planet Xanthoria, but it actually is not. It's a lichen. Now, some of you know that I'm a biologist by profession. I don't study lichens specifically, but I do know quite a bit about lichen. It's a relationship, a close relationship between fungus and algae. And the nice thing about it is that it's a relationship that allows both of them to live in places that neither one of them could by themselves. So lichens are really good. They're hardy as heck, and they can live all sorts of places. One of the species of lichen is Xanthoria, and it has that name because of the Greek word xanthos, which means sort of yellowish, orangish. Xanthoria is a lichen that is bright orange. And I'm willing to bet anyone who's walked in a cemetery has probably seen Xanthoria. If you look at the tops of gravestones, for example, they often have bright patches of orange all over them. And that is Xanthoria. Now, these patches are never on the sides, always on the top. Now, part of the reason why it grows on these monuments, and it's on gravestones, it's on other things, that bowstring arch bridge, for example, that's on the cover of my book, it's covered in Xanthoria. The reason is that it likes lots of calcium. And one of the sources of calcium is concrete. And so it grows very abundantly on concrete. And that's why you'll find it often on things made of concrete. But the other attribute is, and this is now going to be your science lesson for the evening, it is ornithocoprophilous. Everybody get that? Ornithocoprophilous. Ornitho means bird, philus means loving, and copro means bird poop. So ornithocoprophilous means bird poop loving. So the reason it grows on the tops and not on the sides is that's where birds tend to roost. And of course, leaves behind some plops, lots of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, other goodies that lichens like. So that's why they grow abundantly on the tops of things where the birds are roosting. And they actually grow at a fairly definite rate. So you can actually correlate the age of something by the size of the patch of Xanthoria that's on it. The bigger the patch, the older the thing is, because the longer the time the Xanthoria has to grow. So I'm willing to bet, now that you all know this, you will have new eyes when you walk around and you see things that are orange because it's covered in Xanthoria.
Okay, any other questions?
How did you come up with the book idea?
Oh, well, it partly related to some of the things that I talked about tonight. It was the fact that I was out looking for old bridges, the fact that I was trying to reconstruct the routes of the old highways, but it really was that I wanted to share new stories with people that I hadn't talked about in the earlier books. Like the first book, when I did it, there was like 32 chapters, and I thought I had covered everything that I found interesting. There was nothing left for another book. Well, then when I started doing some continued series on the CBC, there was lots of other topics that I could write a book about. And so that's when I did the second book. But then I said, okay, now I've covered everything. That's it. No more books. But I, never say never, because then I found there was a whole bunch of new ideas that I thought were not there. Well, the story of those fallout reporting posts, it had not been for that student of mine, or Gilles, I wouldn't have known anything about those. And I thought, that's a great story. My friend Darren back there and I were conferring, there's a place called the Bergen Cutoff here in Winnipeg. And that's a fascinating story too. And it's just, there's so many interesting stories. And I thought, I want to share this with people. My motive is not at all to make money. It's nice if there's a little bit of cash, but the more important thing for me is sharing these stories with people. And even more importantly than that, hopefully inspiring them to get out on the road. Because that's really what I want people to do. I want people to see the things that I've seen. I'm a proud Manitoban. I hope I always will be. I want people to get out and see this province, because I think when they do, they're going to realize just how fortunate we are to live here. And so I think ultimately the stories that I've shared in this book are hopefully interesting enough that people will go, yeah, I want to know. But the reaction I'm looking for always is, wow, I didn't know that. That's the reaction I hope for with each and every story.
Okay, we have time for a couple more. I think there was a hand over here.
Yeah, I just love the chapter on called West Channel.
Yeah.
The whole Netley Marsh. Just as a kid, my parents owned a boat. We went through that channel. I always asked, why aren't we going to East Channel or the West Channel?
Yeah.
And it's one question. I love the way you covered that they actually made an artificial change in 1903.
Yep.
It looks like about 3/8 of a mile. And one question is, and you wrote that the engineers said it was better to go that way, to go northwest.
Northwest, yes.
Was that a correct decision? And just to cover off Salamonia Channel, Is there much history on that?
Not all I really know about the Salomonia is that apparently it was very popular among the rum runners during Prohibition. But it's basically all but gone now. There's almost nothing left of the Salomonia because of the erosion that has occurred in the marsh. We're getting into new territory here, folks. I'll now put on my scientist hat and give you now a lecture lasting for the next hour. But the reality of you asking about that channel they excavated out towards the lake, the thinking was at the time that if they used the natural channel, which went to the northeast, it would sediment in. And because they had periodic problems with that and they had to dredge the channel fairly frequently. They thought by changing the direction to the northwest, it would be less likely to sediment. I don't know to what extent that was borne out by reality because they continued to dredge right up until 1999. That is still the main entrance and exit to the Lake Winnipeg from the Red River. So maybe it was a smart decision, but there is a cool story about that because it was that land where they did the excavation was owned by a gentleman named Hardman. He had a farm there, which is kind of hard to believe today looking at it, but he had a farm there and he had suffered some flooding, which had forced him to relocate temporarily. While he was away, they went and they dredged that channel and they dredged it right between his house and his barn. So now he couldn't get to his barn from his house. And so he went to the government and he said, look, you've now made it impossible for me to get to my barn. And they went, you're looking at this the wrong way. We have now given you lakefront property on your own.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I got a little bit of, I hope an interesting question, Gordon. In your travels, have you moved up from sleeping in a boxcar to hotels? And secondly, I've never seen or heard you talk about abandoned towns.
Okay, I'll answer each of these in turn. So have I upgraded from sleeping in boxcars to, yes, I have. You probably read my second book then, I guess, because I had a chapter about my life as a roving flax fiber analyst. When I was in university, I worked for a company that made flax fiber paper. And so because I was poor, I was a student, I ended up living in what I called at the time the CP Hotel. Because, hey, I mean, the CP Hotel was downtown Winnipeg, very prestigious. You know, I didn't think anybody would realize that I was actually in the CP boxcars. But no, I stay in hotels because I'm getting old. My back can't take the old floors in those boxcars. Let me think, your second question was abandoned towns. Yes. No, I have thought about that. There have been a couple of books about abandoned towns. It's quite a few years ago now, and it seems to me that it is time it might be right to do another one, largely because there's been many more towns become abandoned since the last book. You know, this is a phenomenon that continues right to today. The fact of the matter is that vast areas of rural Manitoba are being depopulated. And it's unfortunate because there was often very vibrant communities that are now all but empty. And so I think potentially that might be something in my future, is a book on, who knows, ghost towns of Manitoba, or maybe I'll blend it with something else because I'm always interested in new riffs, new ways to look at things. So yes, maybe, or maybe Darren and I will collaborate on a book on the ghost towns of Manitoba. I don't know, but yes, I'm interested in the idea.
So you're saying your wife's going to be a widow?
Or that, or she might be a real widow, because but that might be what happens.
Okay, I think that's our time for these questions. Thank you all for coming tonight. I think I speak for everybody when I say, man, I wish my history teachers in school were this interesting. I spent all these wasted years thinking I just was bored by the subject, but you know, it's the way that it's delivered.
It's how you tell it.
This is fun. So I am going to transport Gordon over to the signing table. We ask that you remain seated for just a few minutes while he settles in over there. And then you are all welcome to join us. We will line up towards the mall, and there will be copies of his book at the cash desk and at the signing desk. There's plenty. We have a bunch of books in the back as well, so we should be able to service everybody. We just ask that even if you pick up a book and get it signed before you pay for it, that you do remember to pay for it before you leave the store.
I don't get a royalty otherwise.
Okay, so thanks to everybody. Thank you to Gordon Goldsborough. Thank you to Great Plains Press, and to all of you for coming in great numbers tonight.
am I gonna be able to have children that